then folks, as we get everybody settled and connected, then we'll officially start the meeting. Okay, so we are recording, so I am going to admit everyone. Hello, welcome to those of you who are joining us. Let everybody's audio get connected. I see we've got a few folks who are still in the process of connecting. We'll give everybody a minute to get situated. A few others here. Great, all right. So we have, looks like most of our members of the public who are joining us have been able to connect by audio, which is great. We welcome you to this 5th meeting of the Interagency Team for the Ballard Interbay Regional Transportation Study. Please be aware, just as we get started with the meeting, I'm going to turn it over to Diane Weider from Seattle Department of Transportation to officially welcome everybody. But please note that this meeting is being recorded. It will be posted on the project website when we wrap up today, so please do just take note of that. My name is Jennifer Wieland. I work with Nelson Nygaard, and we are supporting the City of Seattle on this project. So I will be leading us through our meeting today, and we'll talk us through the agenda and everything that we hope to cover in just a minute. For those members of the public who are joining, again, you're on mute right now. When we move into the public comment period, we will talk about how to shift that so you can come off mute. But I'm going to turn it over to Diane to welcome everybody, and then we will officially get started.
Thanks, Jennifer. Welcome, everyone. Thank you to our interagency team partners for being here. All of our interagency team colleagues are dependent on the transportation system in Ballard Interbay, and all have different roles in making it so the transportation system serves the communities who move through and to Ballard Interbay. So thank you for coming and for your future comments, and for making the Ballard Interbay Regional Transportation System report a better document. I want to welcome the public, and I see from the public we have members of the Magnolia and Ballard communities. We've got folks representing the freight and maritime industries. We have some folks representing the bicycling and walking communities, and we're appreciative that you're all spending your time with us this afternoon, and thank you for attending. And Jennifer will let you know about how you can comment at a later part of the meeting.
Great, thank you, Diane. It does also look like we may have Councilmember Lewis here with us, hiding under a pseudonym. So Councilmember, want to welcome you and certainly invite you to say hello to the group at a point in the meeting as we go through introductions, if you'd like to do that. So let me go ahead and share my screen to get us started. Get all the right pieces in and out of the way. So one thing that I do just want to note for folks, we are in the process of, oh, thank you, Parker. Welcome. Parker Dawson from Councilmember Lewis's office is here, not the council members. So welcome. We're happy to have you here and listening in for the council member's office. So we are working to get closed captioning functional for this meeting. We apologize. There's a little bit of back-end technical difficulty that is happening right now. So we'll do our best to get that fixed, but we're going to go ahead and move through the meeting and can always close caption the recording as a way to ensure this is fully accessible. So what we're going to do in our time together this morning and early afternoon, we are going to spend a little bit of time talking about the contents of the final Ballard Interbay Regional Transportation Study report and the timeline for this last month. It is somehow already October, and November 1st is the date that this is due to the Washington State Legislature. Tom then is going to talk us through where we've landed in terms of the transportation recommendations. So these are still draft and will be refined with the interagency team's feedback over the next couple of weeks. And then we're also going to introduce the preliminary look at timelines and funding strategies, which we know is a topic that is of particular interest and certainly something that is very important as we wrap up this planning project. By 1:05, we'll transition ourselves into public comment and we'll talk more about what that looks like as we go through. So what we're hoping to get out of this 5th meeting with our interagency team is making sure that everybody's got a clear understanding of the next steps as we bring this project to a close, provide an opportunity for feedback on our draft recommendations, and then get some early input as we continue to refine the timelines and funding strategies in particular. So that last piece of content is going to be brand new for everybody, and that is a place where we certainly need our partners' assistance. So we always, I know everybody is Zoom professionals at this point, but just as a quick reminder, so in terms of how our interagency team members are participating, when it's possible for you to use your video, especially if you are introducing yourself or sharing a comment, that's great. You can raise your hand when you have a question, and then certainly chime in throughout the meeting in the chat window, whether that is posing a topic for the group to discuss, for the interagency team to discuss, or just sharing a little bit of commentary as we go. And certainly for our interagency team members, if we're not seeing your raised hand or not seeing your comment in the chat, please do feel free to chime in. For those who are newer to Zoom, all of your controls are along the bottom of the screen. Everybody entered the meeting muted, and so for those members of the public, we will unmute you when we move into the public comment period so that you can share your comments. The way that you raise your hand is by clicking on the Participants tab at the bottom, and that will pop up a window along the right side of your screen, and then at the very bottom, you'll see this button to raise your hand. And then, of course, chat is the little speech bubble. Remember that you have the ability to chat everyone in the meeting. You can also send a direct message to someone. Just be cognizant of what you're doing as you send those messages. And so for our members of the public, again, you are muted at this point in the meeting to support the presentation and the interagency team discussion. We will move to public comment by 1:05 and have 20 minutes for that. You can sign up to speak at this link that is on the screen, and I will read that out for folks who have joined by phone or are not connected, not able to see the screen. And that is tinyurl.com/Ballard Interbay. You can also submit comments through that exact same form. So if there's something that you don't care to share in the meeting, but you'd like it to be documented in the public comment record, you can use that same approach. And Jerry has just posted that web link in the chat box for anybody who would prefer to just click on that. You can also, members of the public, indicate your interest in commenting in the chat box as well. And as we have for previous meetings, I'll do my best to try and monitor chat box throughout and answer any questions through the presentation as we go. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so that we can see our interagency team members as they introduce themselves. So interagency team members, as you introduce yourself today, we'd like you to share one thing that signals the beginning of fall to you. Now that we are at the beginning of October, we're firmly heading into that season, and then love to hear anything that you're hoping to take away from today's meeting. So I'm going to stop sharing. And interagency team members, I'm going to give you 1 second to think about that while I quickly introduce the rest of our project team who's on the line today. So everybody had the chance to meet Diane as she welcomed you all. We also have Chisaki Muraki from Seattle Department of Transportation and Andres Arjona, who are members of Diane's team. From the consultant team, in addition to myself from Nelson Nygaard, we have Tom Brennan, who is our project manager, and Jerry Stroop, who's our deputy project manager. And then we have Kendra Bryland from Fair and Peers, who is one of our technical leads for the project. So with that, interagency team members, I'm just going to call on you. So just remember to unmute yourself as you're ready. So Chris, can we start with you?
Yes, my whole life I've been started with because I have a last name that starts with an A. Um, I'm Chris Arkills. I work in government relations for King County Metro. Let's see, fall is one of my top 4 favorite seasons, and I'm really enjoying cooler evenings, and just hope to continue to learn and work towards our report. So nothing profound. Thanks.
Great. Thanks for being here, Chris. And Chris's colleague, Brant Costner from Metro, will join us about 30 minutes into the meeting as well. Travis, let's go to you next.
Yeah, Travis Phelps from the Washington State Department of Transportation. I'm from the department's new Management of Mobility Division. And gosh, things that, well, I have my rain gutters cleaned. Well, I clean them. So that's usually what I start doing around fall. I start thinking like, oh, I've neglected this thing. So I've conquered my fear of heights this year. So, but yeah, same thing as Chris, just looking for, seeing this report and where it's heading here as we count down the final month.
Great. Thanks for being here.
You bet.
We'll go to Sound Transit next. Chris Rule, can we start with you?
Yeah, I'll go with apple cider, and I am looking forward to hearing more about the phasing or potential phasing of the projects.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Dan?
Yeah, Dan Turner, Sound Transit, project manager on the West Seattle Ballard Link extensions. I think food in general, fall foods, love fall foods. Great opportunity for stews and other delicious foods. And take away from this meeting, I'll just second Chris, just interested in the phasing of these projects and what the recommendations are going forward. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Chris. And we will also be joined by Emily Yasakochi from Sound Transit here in a little bit as well, who's one of the segment leads for the Ballard West Seattle extension. Next, let's go to the port. So today we have Eric Fitch representing the port for Jerry Poor. Eric, go right ahead.
Thanks. And Jerry told me I was going to have to introduce myself and share my objectives for the meeting. So this is substantially easier. So thank you. I'm an October birthday, so I love the fall. I started off usually on October 1st with, I make the first big chili of the year. So I agree that the chili and the stew, that's emblematic. And then I also get out like the big thick cable knit sweater my mom knit for me a decade ago. And that's how you really know that it's fall, is when the cable knit sweaters come out.
Great. And Eric, since you have your objectives already thought about, what would you like to get out of the meeting today?
I'm just here to spread the gospel of freight mobility and jobs. That's what Port's all about. But I'm also really glad to review this work. I've been following along, and I think it's been great. And I'm glad to be a part of this meeting. Great.
Thanks for being here. So it looks like there are a couple other folks from both the SDOT team and also representing elected officials that I do just want to acknowledge. So we're joined by Jacob Thorpe. Welcome, Jacob. And then also I think I saw Jonathan Lewis from the Seattle Department of Transportation. So welcome, Jonathan. And I think that covers our interagency team members. We'll say hello to the other folks as they join us. So at this point, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, and we are going to just ensure that everybody remembers what this study is all about. Diane, do you want to give us the 2-minute overview? And Diane, you're on mute right now.
Thank you for that, Jennifer. So the Ballard Interbay Regional Transportation System project was initiated in 2019 by the Washington State Legislature, and they asked SDOT to develop a report on how to improve mobility for people and goods in Ballard Interbay, and also to make recommendations on a timeline for the replacement of the Ballard and Magnolia bridges. And all of our work has been very tightly tied to the scope of work that the legislature has provided for us. This work culminates really soon at the end of at the end of October, really. And the project elements are as you see them. I think I'll just let you read them even and let you know that we are at this orange arrow point, which means we have developed a draft report, 7 chapters long, many hundreds of pages of appendices that document our technical work of modeling and forecasting. And we plan to get the report to the Washington State Legislature on time and on budget.
Fantastic. Thanks, Diane. All right, great. Well, since we're so close to the end, we figured everybody could go without seeing the legislative language again and just dive right into what will be in this final report. So interagency team members, what we'd love to hear from you after we share some information is just if you've got questions about the way that the report is organized, and then specifically start thinking about how we can best support you and your organizations in review and comment, because it will be a quick timeline, as Jerry will share with us. So Jerry, let me turn it over to you to talk us through what's included in this report.
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer. So as Diane described, there is a lot of content in this report, and we've done our best to organize it in a way that the information is useful and flows together nicely, beginning just with the introduction and purpose of why the Washington Legislature asked the City of Seattle to do this study, providing more context and information just about the area of Ballard Interbay in terms of demographics, jobs, industry, and then moving into network needs and opportunities. And this is really reporting out on a lot of the work that we did through our plan review early on in this work, and the work that Fair and Peers conducted as well with the multimodal needs assessment. So recognizing where there are opportunities to enhance multimodal mobility throughout the whole area, and in particular the key corridors. Covering and introducing the land use scenarios that we're exploring in this study, and reporting out on how they perform overall, getting into the social and economic impacts, and finally ending with the actual recommendations that we're putting forth in this study. The final chapter is the timeline and funding strategy, which is the topic we're going to be spending a fair amount of time on today with all of you. But if you want to jump to the next page, Jennifer, you'll notice that we do have a lot of appendices that are going to be attached to this report. So a lot of it's material and content that you have all already seen. Several of these documents are things that already live on the SDOT project website. But we'll be compiling all of those more technical studies and analyses into the appendix so people can reference those from the more synthesized material that's in the actual report. In terms of what the report will look like, this is a technical study, so to the extent we can, we're trying to really deliver this information in a lot of technical information in a visually interesting way, and makes it easy to understand a lot of the both existing conditions, but also what we're expecting for future conditions in the Ballard Interbay area. So it'll be text paired with a lot of graphics. We're going to have a lot of maps and spreads that have the recommended projects paired with them. And they're doing our best to make sure that the timeline and funding options are clear and make sense for the legislature moving forward. We're also making sure that this is going to be an accessible document for anyone that has visual impairments or needs to access it using a screen reader. So just in terms of schedule, we are working very quickly to deliver this next draft. Our first draft has been completed in September. As Diane noted, chapters 1 through 7. We are now in the process of making revisions. We've reached out to a lot of you interagency members for specific input, and we'll continue to do that as we finalize our second draft, which will be in full layout. And that is the draft that we plan to share with all of you for your more detailed review of all of the content. So that will be coming very soon, and we also are going to be asking for a pretty quick turnaround of comments so that we can make sure we've got everyone's input. On October 22nd, we plan to share out the final plan with the public, so people have one more opportunity to get their eyes on it before we take it to the legislature on November 1st. So we are in the home stretch here now in the month of October, and yeah, if anyone's got questions just about the schedule, let us know.
Great. Perfect. Thank you, Jerry. Thanks for the quick walkthrough of what folks can expect to see. So interagency team members, any questions for Jerry and the rest of the team about what is or isn't included in this? And then also any thoughts you have about how we can best support your organizations in what will be a pretty quick review of a sizable document. And I'll stop
I
sharing.
have one question, if I might.
Yeah, of course, Eric.
So I was deputized by Jerry, our regional transportation manager, but I think it's a good idea. I think we would request, if possible, with time and staff resources available, if we could do an individual agency review, like if we, the port, could sit down with the project team to go through the document, so that we're not just, and it helps hold us accountable, but I think it would also just be helpful to have sort of a conversation about it rather than just sending over text edits. So that was Jerry's idea, but I think it's a good one, and we would love to take you up on that if possible.
Great, that's a great idea, Eric. One of the questions that we do have for the interagency team, we have a placeholder for one more interagency team meeting, I believe on the 15th of October. And so we could use that as a time for the interagency team members to sort of walk through the report with us. But Eric, I like the idea of individual agency meetings as well. So we can pursue both of those. WashDOT, Sound Transit, Metro, thoughts, questions, comments?
I think I'm good with the schedule, and I think we can. What is the date that you want comments back from us? I know we're hopefully circulating the report on the 9th, I believe. And then how quick will that turnaround be?
Yeah. Good question. When we send out that final report, we will include with it some more specific details and instructions about timing. As Jennifer said, we are expecting the following week, the 15th. We've got our next and final IAT meeting scheduled. So we'd love to have as many comments as possible by then, but are expecting by the following week to have had all IAT comments submitted. And if we have some of those one-on-one conversations or meetings with agencies, we'll have that completed by that week as well.
Jerry, I lost your audio for just a second, but I think we're shooting for the 21st of October, right? Would be the yes. Drop dead for any interagency team comments.
Pencils down, yes.
Great, great. And Chris, I see your no questions. Dan, Chris Rule, any questions or concerns on the Sound Transit front? Okay. All right, great. So let's move on then to talk a little bit more about the content of this report and some of the guts here. So when we were together, my goodness, was that a month and a half ago now? How time flies. We spent some time talking through the project recommendations and some of the ways that we were thinking about the interactions between different projects, what was dependent upon one another, and the ways that we were starting to see certain projects kind of rise to the top as we processed all of the public feedback that came through over the early August and really through the later part of July and early August, and then had more discussions with interagency team members as well. And so we've synthesized all of that. We've continued to refine the projects and recommendations and have a draft set to share with you all. But before we do that, we did want to follow up just really quickly on some of the additional modeling work that was being done behind the scenes. So Kendra, let me turn it over to you to talk through what we did and what we found.
Perfect, thank you. So as IAT members know, we've previously reported on only 2 of the scenarios that we've modeled, and we have completed modeling for all 4 scenarios. Just to get a sense of how do different city zoning scenarios for industrial lands impact mobility outcomes, just as how do different bridge assumptions impact mobility outcomes. So just to quickly summarize kind of the 4 scenarios that we've looked at, few things, as you can see on the screen, there's 4. A few commonalities amongst all 4. They all look out to 2042 when Link Light Rail is in place through the study area. And they all anticipate the full level of growth assumed within Seattle's comprehensive plan. And also just some additional refinements within the study area that's common amongst all the alternatives. They assume redevelopment of the Terminal 91 uplands development. They assume redevelopment of Fisherman's Terminal, the Expedia site. They assume development at the Armory. However, the scenarios do vary in some key ways, and I just want to highlight those quickly. The first scenario, and again, scenarios 1 and 2, we've talked to you about these for several of our meetings. They really do test kind of differences around the Ballard and the Magnolia Bridge assumptions. So scenario 1 looks at mid-level replacement of the Ballard Bridge. It also looks at in-kind replacement of the Magnolia Bridge. And again, it has the same kind of land use scenario that I've already described. Scenario 2 looks at the same level of land use within scenario 1, but makes different assumptions about what the bridge replacements look like. So it assumes low-level replacement of the Ballard Bridge, and instead of a Magnolia Bridge in-kind replacement, it's looking at that replacement occurring along Armory Way. For scenarios 3 and 4, we wanted to kind of hold a bridge scenario constant and really look at how different land use and zoning scenarios envisioned within the mayor's maritime and industrial strategy. How do those impact mobility outcomes within our study area? And does that impact what the recommendations might be for investments within this BIRT project? And so scenario 3, it holds constant on that low-level Ballard Bridge replacement and the Armory Way bridge replacement. But it looks at the future of industry scenario within the industrial maritime study. So kind of what that assumes is that some of the city's industrial lands are looking at higher employment types of industrial uses. So be that maker space, essentially just assuming that there's a higher employment density, particularly in those industrial lands that are proximate to light rail stations. The fourth scenario that we looked at, again, holds those bridge assumptions constant. And quite frankly, we could have looked at either of the bridge scenarios with this. We just wanted to make sure that we were holding those constant so we could really look at what the impact of additional zoning might be. And this is looking at the mixed use neighborhoods scenario of the industrial maritime strategy. So that scenario looks at many of our industrial lands are going to stay the same as zone today, but some of those industrial lands that are closest to the outside the periphery of the industrial areas, those industrial lands that are closest to our light rail stations, closest to Ballard, are converting into more of a mixed use neighborhood. So it is introduction of some residential uses within the industrial areas. So those are kind of our 4 scenarios. So if you can go to the next slide, I just wanted to share kind of what some of our high level findings were. So we've talked a lot about scenarios 1 and 2, what we're seeing in terms of that's really helped us craft this project list. Looking at these scenario 3 and 4, really just understanding if some of these industrial lands were to be rezoned, what does that mean in terms of transportation, mobility, and needs within this area? So as would be expected with a higher level of zoning, higher level of intensity, and I should note I would be in scenario 4, the one with more mixed use neighborhoods also contemplates a mixed use redevelopment of the Armory site. So this is really, from a trip generation standpoint, a highest intensity trip generation assumption. When we introduce kind of those, look at how those zoning changes might change needs within the study area, generally most of the recommendations that are within this study, most of these projects, they still work. They really are focused on providing mobility and connectivity and safety. And those sorts of recommendations tend to hold. But I would say that if the city starts looking to rezoning some of these areas to higher intensity uses, it is putting a fair amount of pressure on both Dravis Street and the 15th Avenue corridor. And so if that were to transpire in the future, the city is going to need to think through strategies for this corridor. How do they partner with other agencies to improve corridor operations? Because we are seeing delays beginning to grow, particularly from a vehicle and freight mobility standpoint. Thinking through transit priority investments. So we want people to, as many people as possible, of course, to choose those more space efficient modes, be it transit, walking, and biking. So how do we make sure that those modes continue to get priority and have good progression through the study area, and also the city working with the community to discourage driving, to reduce SOV driving as much as possible, and really, again, just encourage multimodalism throughout the study area. So again, these are just the types of strategies that would need to be contemplated should those sorts of rezoning be something that is advanced. So that's what we looked at, just to kind of share at a high level what we found.
Great. Kendra, one quick question, if you can just remind us all, since it's been a while since we made the decisions about, in particular, those first two scenarios. Can you remind us why we chose these pairings of the two bridges as opposed to, for example, low-level Ballard with in-kind replacement for Magnolia?
I think, we could have picked any combination possible. So at the beginning of the study, we did have to make an assumption. I think these pairings were contemplated as kind of a higher investment scenario, which is really that scenario one. Those are both our more expensive bridge options. And then a lower investment scenario, which scenario 2, 3, and 4 also have that lower cost option.
Great. Thanks so much.
Can I have a question here?
Yeah, Eric, sorry.
So thank you, Jennifer. I was going to ask the exact same thing. I know Jerry has raised that before. From our perspective, we have, I think, well-voiced concerns with the Armory Way option. And so I was going to ask the same. And if that didn't already out me as like a freight shill here, I will out myself further by saying I've been involved in the mayor's process as staff support for our commissioner in the maritime and industrial strategy. It's my job to be paranoid about the rezoning of industrial land, but in this case, it may be that we provide edits or suggestions to the final report. Because as I look at this, I would say that mixed use neighborhoods is not actually something that we've explicitly discussed in the mayor's maritime and industrial strategy process. We have clearly been discussing how we will, how we view development of light rail stations that are in industrial areas. However, we haven't gone so far as to characterize the Armory Interbay area as kind of a mixed-use neighborhood concept. That would be, I think, substantially further than the mayor's panel has gotten yet, or will get by the time this report's finalized. So this is just kind of a bookmark to say, I think that when we follow up with you in our IAT conversations, we may ask for some clarity on how that's characterized, is my only comment.
And I think just to emphasize something that Kendra said, I think we're really driving our planning and our recommendations based on the initial two scenarios, which were much more aligned with comp plan land uses or minor sort of adjustments to land uses in the area. Since there are those types of discussions happening longer term for the Armory site in particular, we thought it was beneficial to the project to take sort of a view of the most impactful land use scenario, which would be, something as we've described here, recognizing that that's far from, any direction that the city has approved or is moving towards, but it tells us as transportation planners, okay, in the most impactful situation, here's the types of operational conditions that we'd be looking at. And I think that's a good sort of gut check for us in terms of our recommendations and making sure that we're planning for freight and transit improvements that could meet those conditions, as well as those more aligned with comp plan land use projections.
I totally agree, and I appreciate that for scenario modeling, especially, you have to look at not just what is happening now, but what might happen in the future, so we get that. And so I think it's not that we would ask that they not be considered. I might just sort of change how they're characterized. Our paranoia as well is, I think, well deserved, because there are, as you know, plenty of people who do want to see upzones happen in those areas. So our sort of, I think, position has always been, the more that they're discussed as things that are going to happen in the future, the more that they'll become accepted by policymakers as a sort of a fait accompli. So we just want to make sure that, and you know, I think the modeling will determine that the more you go to this mixed use, the more conflict there is between freight and single occupancy vehicles, which is something that this study was supposed to look into. So it's totally appreciate that you need to look into that, and we think it'll, the findings will sort of support our preservation of industrial lands ethos, but it just may be something we discuss more in our feedback for you. So I wanted to air it here. Thank you for letting me do so.
Yeah, no point well taken, and I think it's also important to point out that transportation analysis that Kendra's team's been doing is being coordinated with OPCD and the mayor's office work as well, to do just what you're calling out, to kind of recognize how those types of potential future land use scenarios might impact travel.
Great. Yeah.
And I would like to add that these ideas are all conceptual at this point, and if there were to be some kind of development, say in the Armory, that was residential mixed use, they would have to do a very thorough EIS that would have a transportation element. And so our work is kind of a higher level guidance than the kind of work that would be done associated with an EIS.
Thanks, Diane. And Kendra, thanks for that quick overview. Eric, really appreciate you sharing the port's perspective on this as well. I think that's a helpful way to also frame what we're seeing in terms of the draft transportation recommendations. So Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you to walk through these recommendations, and then we'll have some more interagency team discussion as we go.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. And I'll be fairly quick on this section, since we have spoken with the IAT about a lot of what's here in our last meeting or two. Just kind of a heads up for when you get the report and have a chance to review that. Within the recommendations chapter, we've kind of bucketed recommendations into what we're calling key investments. This includes both the bridge options as well as some of the key multimodal investments that really sort of rose to the top in terms of priority and need. Because there's a lot of interest from specific modal stakeholders, both public and private, and because what we're really trying to do here is build a set of quality modal systems. We also present the recommendations by mode. So there's a bit of repetition in the report, you'll find, but we thought that was important so that a bike advocate or a freight advocate can look at the report and really kind of understand how the BIRT recommendations are set up to improve or protect travel and access for that particular mode. And then, because this is a long-term plan, and because this is happening in a funding environment where funding is incredibly limited, we also wanted to call out, some of the smaller, lower-cost projects that might be more viable for implementation. And so there's a section in the report that also talks about what some of those are. Again, I think you guys have been through this process with us, so just a quick reminder that the recommendations in the report really come from a deliberative process where we started with a very long list of projects, work closely with you to develop goals and some clear evaluation criteria, work through that technical process, including input directly from the IAT, as well as the public and various other stakeholder groups that we've been informed by, and so those results that you'll see in the report are reflective of what we feel to be a good process and a lot of both technical work as well as stakeholder and public input. One of the things we wanted to be, I think, just kind of abundantly clear about at this point, since at the outset of this project there may have been some expectation that we would land with a single recommended replacement or rehab alternative for each of the two bridges, Ballard and Magnolia bridges. We did want to be clear that the report, as it's distributed to the legislature and the city council, and your various leadership, We'll continue to carry forward 2 alternatives for each bridge rehab or replacement. As you know, planning studies have been either completed in the case of the Magnolia Bridge or are still underway, nearing completion for the Ballard Bridge, that looked at a range of alternatives, up to 4 alternatives for each replacement. The city is comfortable at this point carrying forward and reducing the number of alternatives to each of these 2. However, these are big infrastructure decisions with very significant price tags, and given 2020 in general, but many things that have been happening, including the pandemic and the related budget impacts, and certainly some of the time pressures on council and decision makers, it's just not been possible to deliver a single decision on either of these. So as we talked about in the past, the report is set up to talk about some of the trade-offs between each, and describe how the other suite of multimodal projects may or may not be related to these 2 alternatives. So that may be a question in people's mind. We did want to just be abundantly clear about that as you get the document to review and are understanding the context of the recommendations. So just quickly to touch on some of the key investments that we're calling out in the report. I think nothing here is new to the IAT, but maybe just the framing and what we've sort of raised to the top in terms of key investments is worth reviewing. And hopefully folks can see this map or have a copy of it, but I'll just run through a few of the key elements. Certainly the pedestrian improvements around the future station areas are critical. And while those station area projects may seem a bit far out yet, we know it takes time to implement some of these projects. So it's certainly worth planning for and beginning to make some of those pedestrian and bicycle improvements prior to the light rail project. A couple of the key corridors that were really stressed through our technical and public process in terms of what we're calling along the roadway improvements, which are really more sort of comprehensive pedestrian quality and experiential improvements along more significant corridors include the 14th Ave Northwest corridor, which will obviously be a really important corridor for pedestrian access to the Ballard station, where a lot of walk-up access is expected in a fairly dense neighborhood. And then also along the 15th Ave West corridor. Really, not surprisingly, again, with this project, there's several kind of critical corridors that merit multiple types of investments. So north of the Ship Canal, there's the Leary Way Northwest corridor. Improvements here include future rapid ride lanes between 15th and Market, additional passenger facility improvements, bike improvements at some key locations like Leary and 8th, ITS improvements to help improve freight mobility. And I think, also need to stress that, this corridor has important relationships with the Shilshole Ave Northwest corridor as well, which provides some important goods and freight connections to businesses closer to the waterfront. The 15th Ave West and Elliott Way corridor, obviously the most critical regional corridor in this study area, carries high volumes of trucks with pretty significant increases in truck volumes expected over the course of the study period. Really important bus transit corridor, a high ridership corridor, as well as a corridor that carries a lot of vehicular travel. And one that was also really stressed as an important corridor for improvements to active transportation modes as well. So we talked a little bit about pedestrian improvements. There's also a tremendous amount of support for cycling improvements in this corridor. Given the spatial constraints here, we've really suggested in the report that the Elliott Bay Trail extension, which is the green line east of the Burlington Northern tracks there, be stressed as an opportunity to create some north-south all ages and abilities connectivity, again, east of the Burlington Northern tracks, which I think is really where we heard a lot of need for safer, more connected cycling facilities. And then the other corridor I would really point to that Kendra mentioned is the with a fairly short stretch of West Dravis Street, but really a very important connection across 15th and across the tracks. Obviously a corridor as well that's quite constrained by what are actually two separate structures or bridges, which have fairly lacking pedestrian facilities and narrow rights of way that challenge expansion of the right-of-way or even repurposing of right-of-way for improved bicycle facilities, as well as transit and freight activity. So, the report does suggest that there's, it will be important in the future to look at potential replacement of those bridge decks. But obviously with the recognition that the city has a huge backlog of bridge operations and maintenance, not to mention the significant cost of potentially replacing or repairing other bridges. So that's a quick overview of some of the key projects that really kind of rose to the top of the overall plan. Just quickly, kind of to frame up how some of the bike and ped projects are framed, again, really focusing on those 10-minute walk buffers of the light rail stations, emphasizing some of the potential improvements along Dravis that could benefit cyclists and pedestrians. One recommendation that the Fair and Pierce team evaluated quite extensively and thought would be beneficial to not only street operations, but to bikes and peds is the idea of a roundabout at Dravis and 17th Street. Talked about the Elliott Bay Trail extension. And another thing that I think really came up extensively and we want to emphasize in this plan is the need for better ship canal crossings for cyclists. And the plan really includes two options. One, improvements to the Ballard Lock connection that would allow 24-hour cycle access on bike. And then what could be an interim improvement or could be a phased improvement to one of the Ballard Low Bridge alternative, and that is expansion of the deck to include a sort of full width bicycle facility crossing the Ballard Bridge. Jeff, you want to jump to the next slide? There you go. So again, in terms of some of the key transit and freight projects, 15th Ave and Northeast, 15th Ave Northeast and Market, it's an area where we see a lot of congestion, and so looking at some queue jumps for transit there. Building on some of the work the city's doing on the Route 40, those bus lanes we talked about. There's a few transit improvements that would be tied to the Armory Way alternative along Thorndike, both for transit priority as well as connectivity to those modes. We talked a bit about Dravis as a corridor that really could use reliability improvements. So we're looking at both signal operations as well as potential for a longer term bridge replacement. We continue to move forward with the recommendation of freight access transit lanes on 15th Ave West as an opportunity to provide some priority for trucks along that corridor, shared with transit. And then there's a kind of host of intersection improvements that could include signal opportunities to improve both freight and transit throughput. And then, I think we talked a little bit about some of the small, low-cost projects. I won't go through these all in detail, but again, a lot of these have bring a little bit more specificity to some of those pedestrian crossing and safety and signalization improvements within the station areas, as well as along some of the more heavily trafficked corridors where crossings can be challenging, like 15th Ave West. So you can see a number of the both ped and bike projects, which are in orange and green, center around Ballard and are within that station area zone. There's a number of cycling improvements at high collision locations along 8th Ave Northwest. And then certainly as you scan along 15th Ave West there's opportunities for improved signalization or, creating crossing opportunities where there's fairly significant gaps without a signalized intersection. And then, one corridor that we included in this kind of small low cost category is the Emerson Nickerson Street. This is obviously an important corridor for freight and goods movement, and there's, I think, a series of kind of smaller ITS and signalization projects that in combination could really help to improve freight reliability in particular along this important east-west corridor.
All right, great, thank you, Tom. As we move into our interagency team discussion here, I do want to acknowledge that we've been joined by Brian Costner from King County Metro and Emily Yasakochi from Sound Transit. They've been here since at least the beginning of this project discussion, so welcome, and my apologies that I forgot to acknowledge you both as we started this section. So with all of that information that both Kendra and Tom have just shared, and thinking a little bit about the key investments in particular, some of the nearer term investments, we're curious to hear from our interagency team members. Of course, if you have comments or questions, but really in particular, if there's anything that is missing or any projects that seem to be in conflict with one another. And I will again stop sharing my screen for a minute so you can have some discussion, but happy to pull back up the key investments map or anything else if that would be useful. So Dan, it looks like you've got a question or comment, Dan Turner?
Yeah, and I think actually your prompt actually, I don't know if any of these projects are in conflict with one another, but that was my question, was how the report will address instances where there might be conflicts between priorities. I think the ITS solutions and the non-motorized come to mind as areas where there might potentially be conflicts. And then so I'll leave that question, and then my comment is specific to the 14th Avenue recommendations. I don't recall exactly what those were, but just to, this may be self-explanatory, but just to continue to coordinate with our project on the 14th Avenue, as our preferred alignment does go right up that corridor. So that'll be something to continue to coordinate with. And also on the roundabout suggestion as well, as I think our current preferred station at the Davis location is right where that roundabout is suggested, and there could be interesting coordination there. That's it. Thanks.
No, perfect. So I will note that in terms of continued coordination, absolutely, these are still largely at the conceptual level in terms of many of the recommendations, and so certainly ongoing collaboration and partnership with our interagency team members in the community will certainly be needed. Tom or Kendra, do you want to talk just a little bit about the ways that we have tried to resolve conflicts between projects? Because we've definitely done some of that as we've whittled down these recommendations, but do you want to talk about any areas that might still exist?
Tom, I'd be
Sure.
happy to. Oh, go for it,
Go
Tom.
ahead. No, you first.
Tom,
And I'll follow.
So that's a really good question. That is something that, as we're laying it out, I think there's still some refinements to be done. But that is actually why we've actually started to look at some of the key corridors. So we identified some of our key corridors where we're seeing a lot of those projects clustering along. 15th is clearly one of them. Dravis is one of them. Leary Way is one of them. And so we are specifically laying out what those project recommendations are, seeing how they fit. This, of course, isn't a design study. So, we're not at a place where we're going to be able to say, we need 3 feet of right of way here to fit this. But we are really thinking about those modal interactions and specifically intersections where you do see the confluence of all those modes and thinking critically about how that would work. And through our some of the more corridor specific strategies, the operation strategies, that was very much taken into account. So Tom, did you want to chime in there at all?
You said almost exactly what I was going to say, and I think 15th is a great example of where based on both technical work and our public feedback, almost every mode is desired for improved operations in that corridor, and so I think we try to recognize that in the report, but also also recognize that some of the sort of detailed engineering and dimensional work that would need to be done to rectify some of those questions will require some follow-on work.
Great, thanks. Other interagency team members, comments, questions, thoughts? Eric?
I have a question. Yeah, maybe a question and a comment. So I know Jerry and I and a number of other port colleagues talked about the so-called fat lanes. I'm intrigued by the idea. I like the idea of sharing modes between two sort of underrepresented freight or transportation users. But I was going to ask whether, and I think I'd asked Jerry, so she may have already sent this, but whether that was based on successful implementation elsewhere in the country. I think especially for policymakers in Olympia, if they know that that's not our brand new idea and it's been tried somewhere else, that could be cool to include somewhere. And then if our transit advocate friends, who we often support with multimodal support in their quest for multimodal funding because it reduces the conflict between freight and single occupancy vehicles, if they have concerns about sharing lanes with trucks. I don't know if that's something that you've turned up, and then maybe you could answer that and I'll make my comment after that.
Great. Tom or Kendra, do you want to chime in with any precedents, and then we can open it up to Chris from Metro, maybe to chime in on the transit perspective?
I will have to follow up on precedents. I believe that they are there. I just don't have those sitting in my head. So I apologize for not having that information today, Eric. That's something that we'll follow up with. But this isn't an idea that was generated just by our team. It's been one that's been discussed. I know Dr. Ann Goodchild at UW has talked about this concept. So we'll follow up if where those other examples exist.
Yeah. I know PBOT in Portland has an active pilot for freight and transit access on the MLK Grand corridor. So those of you familiar with Portland, it's kind of it's the old Highway 99. It's the major north-south arterial running east of the river through the central city, and they put some transit lanes in there to serve bus and streetcar several years ago. It's also a major north-south truck corridor. So they are piloting a similar concept.
That's actually, I'm very familiar with that area. I grew up down there, and that's right by the East Side Industrial area too. So as you say, it's kind of developed more now as an entertainment and residential corridor where it used to be industrial, and you do see the Max or the streetcar and the trucks on that same MLK stretch. So thanks, that's a good example.
Yeah, it is a good comparable in a lot of ways in terms of some of the historic industrial uses and development pressure that's in that area.
Great. And Eric, before we have you chime in with your comment as well, Chris, did you want to jump in on Metro's perspective in terms of sharing lanes with freight?
Sure, and Brand may want to jump on too. I think we're intrigued by the possibilities. I don't know of any specific examples myself, so I haven't seen them work. We, in essence, kind of have a fat lane coming out of West Seattle right now because the lower bridge is restricted to freight transit and first responders right now to manage the bridge. And we've been coexisting pretty well. I think one of my major concerns would be time of day, making sure that the time of day matches up. If we're both busy in the AM peak going the same direction, that may be a challenge, you know, but maybe it's not. So I think that's something to pay attention to is the peak times for freight and the peak times for transit. And of course, buses do need to stop in those lanes. So that may require freight to wait for 30 to 90 seconds on occasion when the bus stops, you know.
Yeah, I think we're similar. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Chris, but I mean, I think we're the same. We're intrigued by the idea. And it's a great point about the West Seattle Bridge. So I think it'd be cool to kind of consider a couple case studies, maybe for inclusion in the report so that people could picture it in practice. But generally speaking, I think all of us at the port were sort of intrigued and hope it could work out.
Mm-hmm.
And the only comment I was going to make is, and I don't know, you know, I'm a latecomer here in some ways. Jerry's been keeping us up to date, so I'm sorry to parachute in, but just in thinking about, you know, the multimodal conversations down there and the, you know, sort of shared goal of making this a corridor that's that flows freely for freight and for passengers, which means, you know, incenting people to get out of cars into transit, et cetera. Reducing freight congestion comes with major air quality benefits as well. And, you know, hence the federal government's congestion mitigation and air quality program, CMAQ, longtime federal grant program that goes to freight. And so I'd like maybe if in presenting this to legislators so that they don't think of it as just straight up choosing between trucks and cars, just presenting them to the concept that anything we do to reduce freight congestion on this corridor also improves air quality for the communities that are located around there too. So that's just, when we talk about freight internally, we try to reference that. And I think it's helpful to remind policymakers of that as well.
Great. Thank you for sharing that, Eric. It is something that has come up many times in our conversations with the public is, you know, what is the climate focus of this particular study? And I think that's an important element to add.
Glad it's come up. Thanks.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Chris, was there something else that you were wanting to add as well?
No, I didn't really have anything else to say. I was wondering if Brand had wanted to add anything to what I said, but I think we're okay.
Great. Hi, Brand. Welcome. Anything you wanted to add?
I think Chris and Eric covered the fat lanes pretty well. But one thing I did want to add, and just some additional comments, questions that we have about the recommended projects. I think you covered kind of the wide array of queue jumps, the Route 40 improvements, some of these just major corridors that transit has an interest in continued speed and reliability. You also kind of touched on these pedestrian improvements and better sidewalk connectivity, crosswalk improvements. And I just want to make sure that we continue to have this nexus in our planning work between improving the pedestrian and bicyclist environment and making sure those connections are not only to the light rail stations along this corridor, but to the rapid ride stops and bus stops along this corridor, and making sure that we're doing what we can through all these improvements to see that connection as really important as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Brandon, and we certainly have been taking that into consideration. I think, and I may have neglected to say that in my presentation. I think one of the lucky things is that a lot of these improvements serve double duty in that regard. So while they may benefit access to light rail stations in the long run, a lot of the pedestrian impediments and safety issues are fairly comparable.
Great, thanks, Brand. Thanks, Tom. Travis, anything to add from WashDOT's perspective?
I don't think so. I think I'd just like to sit down with the list and give it a good once over.
Sounds great. And then Chris or Emily, anything else to add from Sound Transit?
I guess I was just add a little comment on the speed and reliability. The piece of the, not specific to fat lanes, but transit only, and the use of the outside lanes through 15th and Elliott. It's a bit of a patchwork right now. And so I've heard questions about whether there's a benefit even to just having consistency through that area. And then just being careful, I think like specifically that area between Mercer and the Magnolia Bridge going northbound, there's a lot of mixing in that area and changing lanes. And so as we think about for getting further into design with a transit only or fat lane in that area, thinking about people sort of changing lanes to make that exit off out of the Magnolia Bridge.
Yeah, that's a really good point, particularly for the southbound movement there. A lot of the buses are crossing over. So, yeah.
Great, thank you for that. All right, I think then that I'm going to keep us moving. We're just a little behind time, and I want to make sure that we have some time to talk about implementation and funding, which of course is always on people's minds. So just a quick reminder before we go into this section, for members of the public who are interested in either providing comment today or would just like to have a public comment noted, please go to www.tinyurl.com/Ballard Interbay. Or you can, of course, in the chat indicate your interest in providing comment, and then I'll also ask for raised hands when we move into that portion of the discussion. So the next big topic that we want to tackle for the next 25 minutes or so is around timeline and funding strategy. And the feedback that we're looking for today from our interagency team members is really, you know, this is the first time you're seeing this information. It's just been developed. And so we really want to hear from all of you if you've got questions about the assumptions that we're using and the approach that we are taking to develop this piece of the plan. And then certainly, as with everything, you'll have a chance to dive in a little bit more detail as we go. So Tom, you want to move us through this piece?
Yeah, sure. And just a couple of points of context as we dig into this important part of the study and where we're heading. You know, first off, I think you'll hear a few times throughout this section that we're in a really much different space in terms of thinking about funding and bridge priorities right now than we were when this study commenced. And that's a very, very true thing. At the same time, you know, SDOT understands that both these bridges are critical to the transportation system and recognizes that they're a very important priority. So we're certainly respecting and balancing those two things. So I just want to make sure that, you know, as people hear about the West Seattle Bridge and the focus there, it doesn't mean that these aren't important parts of our transportation infrastructure. I think one other piece of important context, which was really reaffirmed in a City of Seattle audit of its bridge operations and maintenance program that came out just a couple of weeks ago, is that, you know, the city's available funding, not even for bridge replacement, but just for bridge operations and maintenance, relative to the need, is at a, you know, historically significant discrepancy. I think the bridge audit called out that the City of Seattle is able to spend about $6.5 million per year over the last 10 years or so on average on bridge maintenance and operational upgrades. The audit called for a need probably somewhere in the range of $34 million a year just to satisfy sort of annual operations and maintenance needs to keep its current 77 auto bridges, vehicular bridges, operational. So that's a little context around just some of the overall system challenges that the city is facing. Obviously, and you can go to the next slide, Jennifer. Obviously, on top of that, nobody would have expected that the West Seattle High Bridge would be closed at this point. That is an emergency condition for the city and many of its partners. And SDOT is putting a tremendous amount of resource into working to find a solution either to repair or replace that bridge. And so that will put a tremendous amount of funding stress on the city. The city's already had to take out a $70 million interagency loan to pay for some of those activities and does not have funding identified for that repair or replacement. So it is really hard at work identifying solutions for paying for that important water crossing of the Duwamish. So all that's a little context around what we're doing here in the BIRT study, which per the legislation is to provide some recommendations for both a timeline and a strategy for funding the replacement or rehabilitation of the Magnolia and Ballard bridges. And again, these are expensive, very expensive capital projects. I think if you look at the typical types of major infrastructure projects that the city has dealt with over the last decade or two, there's very few that rise to the level of investment that is required based on either the Ballard Bridge or the Magnolia Bridge replacement costing in those planning studies. So that's just a little bit of context. As we go through this process of sort of identifying the timeline for replacement, one of the things that we've been working closely with the SDOT bridge engineering team on is sort of understanding sequentially sort of how they would, how they typically move through this type of major infrastructure project. And so this slide is kind of representative of that, not too dissimilar from any sort of major infrastructure project. There's the planning phase. In the bridge world, there's what we call type, size, and location study, which really is the study of sort of what type of bridge would be built. Obviously, there's many different bridge types that are more or less applicable to local conditions. So that's not a step that's been taken for either one of these bridges. Then there's quite a bit of engineering work, often that's split up into 3 or 4 different phases, 30% design, 60% design, et cetera. There's an environmental process that would run parallel to that engineering. There's a process to bring on contractors for construction. There's right-of-way acquisition, often even with bridge replacements, different ramp locations, different bridge sizes, expansion can still require acquisition of right-of-way. And then there's the process of actually building or rehabbing. But sometimes that's the lesser of the of the time to get through these processes. So I think as we look through this, and we'll show you some graphics that we're working on to kind of demonstrate cost and time frame for each of the bridge alternatives. I think it's important to recognize that there's some differences between the two alternatives and how or whether it's possible to phase the replacement or rehabilitation. And so with both sets of options, there are certainly some differences. With the Ballard Bridge, the mid-level alternative, is a full replacement of that bridge. So that is not an alternative that can be phased. In other words, that you could fund incremental elements of that project and build them. You'd ultimately need full construction funding to complete that project. With the low level rehabilitation, that's not necessarily the case. Those improvements could be made in phases, and there's some different options for that. But just to provide some examples of what that might look like, the pedestrian and bicycle cantilevers from that bridge could be potentially an early phase of development. That's a priority out of this process. The planned interchange at the south end of the bridge is a major component of that project that could potentially be done incrementally some of the bridge approaches could be built incrementally. So so that certainly is a major sort of difference in terms of the ability to fund and implement that project incrementally. For the Magnolia Bridge, obviously the in-kind replacement alternative cannot be phased. That's a new structure. That's a new bridge. The Armory Way alternative could have some phasing options in that it's there are multiple pieces to that alternative. Obviously, the Armory Way connection across the tracks would need to be completed as a single component of that project to create that new connectivity. But some of the elements, such as the Terminal 91 access at Garfield and Thorndike, could potentially be phased separately. So I think that's just some important context. So don't squint too hard because you don't need to necessarily understand all of this, but I think we wanted to sort of preview that as we roll out the draft. We will be describing at a planning level, at least, sort of what the likely range of time frame would be to complete each one of those sort of major project development stages. You'll see some X's in there, in part because we're still working with the engineering team to kind of get the right range of time for each of those, but also sort of the rough level of cost associated with each of those phases as well, based on work completed in those two planning studies. And I think the thing to stress here, given the financial position that the city's in, which is there's not money for any of these phases currently, is that we don't necessarily need all the funding, full construction and planning and design costs to start these processes. Each of these individual steps can be funded sequentially. For example, if we need $5 to $7 million for a type, size, and location study, that is a pot of funding that could be developed through various local and grant sources to commence that stage of work. One of the things that's important to recognize is that if this project development process is sort of funded incrementally, then that is reliant on the city and partners' ability to generate funding for the next phase, so as not to create delays between various phases of the project. This is not an insignificant challenge given the current funding situation and relatively significant level of cost for each of these phases. I think those of you who are familiar with sort of typical local and regional sources available for these types of efforts know that generating $11 or $17 million for a design phase is not an insignificant task. And again, similarly, this is for the Magnolia Bridge. Again, kind of breaking out some of those various costs and phasing. So we don't need to get into detail on that, I think, Jennifer.
Yeah, Tom, one question that has come up, and I don't know if you are able to answer this or maybe Kendra could chime in. I think there may have been a previous type, size, location study done for the Magnolia Bridge when sort of post-earthquake and when there was an assessment of damage. Does anybody know if that would need to be redone or any status on that? And we can certainly follow up on it. I just wanted to check.
And I'm muted here.
I'll take that. Kendra, yeah, go ahead.
There are, so just looking through the studies that we've reviewed, there's a preponderance of them. So I'm kind of looking at all the ones we have for Magnolia. There are some of that magnitude. I can't recall exactly all of them, but I know as a part of the study, we kind of looked all the way back to 2000 at different documents. I would just posit that I think to the extent that some of these studies are more than 10 years old, they probably would need to be refreshed, as a lot of the assumptions just would be too dated.
Okay, great. That's sort of what I was thinking as well, but just wanted to ask, and we can certainly follow up and clarify on that a little bit more. So that may mean we have a couple of steps less to do in some cases, but may need to do them again.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Tom. Thanks.
So in terms of, of funding, the one of the things that's clear is that, for both of these projects, SDOT is going to need to pursue both local, regional, state, and federal sources to fund this type of project. Bridge funding tends to be, complex and multi-dimensional. So, partnerships with state and federal partners, as well as local partners, is going to be absolutely critical in this work. I do think it's really important to reflect that a key piece of this study is really to emphasize to the state the need for state participation in funding these important infrastructure projects. Again, as we talked about, the state or the city is looking at these projects through the lens of a number of bridge infrastructure needs. And as we've spoken to folks at the city, and certainly as we talked to some of the partners on this call as well, including the port, they have stressed that the West Seattle High Bridge replacement and tackling that crossing of the Duwamish is really, a top priority, I think. In talking to Eric's colleague Jerry, she said these are very much the types of projects that the port has a history of supporting, but right now we're pretty laser focused on working with the city to help address the Duwamish crossing and some of the impacts that accrue to the manufacturing industrial center there. So I think those are important things to recognize. And so the report calls out a funding strategy, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the local, state, and federal options that are discussed in the context of the report. On the local side, obviously the city's passed a Move Seattle levy that expires in 2024, so there'll be an opportunity to go back to the voters to renew that, or with the sort of next version of that multimodal levy. So that certainly presents an opportunity to generate some funding for bridge infrastructure. Hopefully the West Seattle bridge will be funded in other ways by that point, but that's hard to say. And certainly there's, we need to recognize that is a multimodal funding package. So there will certainly be needs there just in terms of basic street operations and maintenance, but a host of other bicycle, pedestrian, transit projects that rely on that levy for funding. There's a host of other options that the city could certainly look at that would certainly require a lot more study, things like tolling or use of congestion pricing funds. These are fairly nascent ideas, and not ones that would happen without a lot of community conversation. Things like value capture have certainly been considered, or local improvement districts, but again, I think those are generally reliant on a fair amount of land use development. So those are things that could be tied into future considerations about land uses in the area. So again, that next levy may be one of the better opportunities for some local funding. Again, at the local level, I think the hope is that there could be a future legislative package, maybe in line with the Connecting Washington gas tax package right now that's being used to fund projects around the state. And key piece of this project will be to help the city position for funding for these types of projects. There are a host of other state programs, the local bridge program, the freight mobility, strategic investment board, that's helped direct projects to previous projects like the Lander Street overcrossing, that will certainly be looking at here as opportunities. And then on the federal front, Jennifer, you want to flip to the next slide? I won't get into a lot of detail here. There are a host of federal funding sources, and I'd kind of split these into two groups. There's programs like the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, or what was previously referred to as Surface Transportation Program, that directs funds to the region through PSRC that are allocated through a competitive process. There's other funding sources like that, including the CMAQ program that Eric spoke about, and the Transportation Alternatives Program. Those are competitive processes, and those might be available to fund certain components of a bridge project. There's a number, or a couple at least, sort of major grant programs that are national and highly competitive, that might be targets for this type of infrastructure project. Programs like the BUILD program or the infra program, but I think it's worth stressing that those are highly competitive and typically allocated to relatively few projects across the entire United States. One other thing that I think is worth noting as we're pulling together the funding strategy is that many of the federal sources for these types of projects are designated for roadways or infrastructure like bridges that are part of the national highway system. So that includes both the Eisenhower highway system, that major roads like I-5 and I-90, but also has kind of a local roads component to it. So 15th Ave West and the Ballard Bridge are part of that Tier 2 national highway system network. The Magnolia Bridge, on the other hand, is not part of the national highway system. So there are more restrictions on federal funds and federal funding availability for that bridge project. Obviously, not everything in this plan is a bridge, and so I want to talk a little bit about funding non-bridge projects. I think it's important to recognize that because this is a legislatively directed sort of special project, some of the bike and pedestrian transit projects that come out of this will need to be integrated and reconciled with the City of Seattle transportation planning process, which is typically to develop and update modal plans, and then those longer term modal plans are used to direct 5-year implementation program. So for projects that are recommended through the BIRT that aren't part of existing modal plans, there'll be some reconciliation through the modal plan update processes to get those integrated and make sure they're aligned with citywide needs. So go ahead, Jennifer. I think that's the key point there.
Good. Okay. All right. Great. Thank you. That's a lot. It's a lot of information there, both in terms of all of the different steps that it takes when we think about a rehabilitation or a replacement of a bridge, and then also a lot to consider in terms of funding sources. And Tom, as you noted, there are always competing priorities for funding, but particularly at this moment when the West Seattle Bridge is at the forefront of a lot of the conversations around around funding, the competition is even fiercer in some ways. So we've got a couple of minutes to hear from our interagency team members around any comments or questions, both related to the assumptions that we've shared and then any initial thoughts on the funding sources we've teed up or opportunities for partnerships. So let me stop sharing and see if folks have comments or questions on this piece. I know Eric had to leave us, so let's see. So I won't pick on him first. Travis, any thoughts from WashDOT?
Yeah, I guess just to kind of talk about the state as a whole, there's a many, I'm trying not to be a downer here, but there are a lot of cities, both interstate and nationally, that are really hurting right now. I mean, a lot of us are funded with gas tax revenue. I know WashDOT's budget's taken a heck of a hit, and we're reprioritizing projects. My point in bringing that up is the more that we can talk about the overall needs with a single voice and stay coordinated on that, I think the better chance we'll have of seeing projects like this get some funding in the future. So, and that's probably not going to be a temporary thing. I think the recovery is definitely going to be at least a multi-year effort. So staying coordinated on that. And, I think, even past the West Seattle Bridge timeline, I'd say let's stay focused and keep talking, but the more coordinated we can be, the better.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that state perspective too. It is, certainly when we talk about federal funds, we know there's a lot of competition, but the same is true at a state level when we think about what's happening to budgets and the needs across the state as well. Partners from Sound Transit or Metro, any comments or questions at this point?
I don't think Brand or I have anything on behalf of Metro. Obviously I would echo a lot of what Travis says. The infrastructure needs are enormous, and as a West Seattleite, I'm very interested in the repair of that or replacement of that bridge.
You and all your neighbors, plus many others, absolutely. All right, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Brant. We certainly know that Metro's budget has had its challenges as well, just like every other agency. So recognize that there are a lot of capital needs that are currently unfunded when it comes to transit as well.
Absolutely, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Sound Transit Partners, anything to add?
Nothing. This is Emily from Sound Transit, nothing to add. Thanks.
Great. Okay, Chris. Sorry. All right, great. Well, this is certainly going to be a key focus of review for all of you, I know, when you are looking at the draft report. Tom, anything that you want to say just in terms of what folks should expect in this particular, anything else that you want to add in terms of what folks should expect when they see the draft for this particular portion?
No, I think, hopefully I laid out the keys there. I think certainly, on the transit side, we recognize that there's not a lot of opportunity in this corridor for federal transit dollars, given given the light rail projects on a separate alignment, and we'll be seeking federal dollars separately. So I don't think there's much there in terms of transit funding coordination. So yeah, please give it a close look and look forward to your comments.
Great. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, we are through that big chunk of technical presentation. So I want to move us into the public comment portion of our meeting, and we'll take about 20 minutes for this, which is what we planned in our agenda. So members of the public, if you would like to comment, again, you can sign up at www.tinyurl.com/Ballard Interbay, or just simply leave a comment there, or you can raise your hand or raise your hand in Zoom. So again, click the participants tab at the bottom and then hit the raise your hand button, or you can turn on your camera and wave at me. That sometimes works. Or you can drop your name or just say that you'd like to share a comment in the chat box. I do have a couple of folks who signed up online. So we'll go through those folks and then we'll come to those of you who have your hands raised. For those of you who are connected via the web, we will ask you to unmute yourselves when it is your turn to speak. And for those of you who have dialed in by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. And then when it's your turn to speak and we've called out the last 4 digits of your phone number, you'll press *6 to unmute yourself. We should have plenty of time to get through everybody, but I would remind us all to try and limit our comments to about 2 minutes per person. So we want to focus our questions and comments on the information that's been shared today and anything that you'd like to make sure that both your agency partners and the project team consider as we take the next steps in the project. So I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see you all. So first up, in terms of folks who signed up to comment, we have Ray Dubicki. So Ray, let me ask you to unmute yourself. And there we go. Hi, Ray, please go ahead.
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and thank you to all the interagency partners. Greatly appreciate all the work that everybody's been able to put in. I just wanted to bring up a couple technical things that spotted in the financial and the plans that have been outlined. As always, there is no discussion of rail in this package. We talk about freight, we talk about freight, we talk about freight, and none of it is connecting to the giant resource that all this infrastructure is supposed to be moving around. That also includes the question of reopening the North Gate at Port 91, at Terminal 91, and being able to connect through that, especially if we're having an Armory Way connection across the rail lines. Seeing that the intersection of Dravis is supposed to be widened and improved in certain ways, I'm curious as to how that coordinates with the location of the south end of the Ballard Bridge, because there has been a lot of talk about how those two things cannot compete with one another. And I want to be able to see and understand how changes to the Dravis Street interchange affect the Emerson, Nickerson, and Ballard Bridge intersection. Finally, I have a huge concern that the pedestrian improvements and the bicycle improvements are routing very tiny lines around very big pieces of road infrastructure. I would have loved to see more coordination in the road infrastructure so that we could have more significant improvements to the pedestrian improvements. So those are the 3 big things that I wanted to bring up. Rail connections, Dravis Street, and the very narrow pedestrian and bicycle improvements. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Ray, for the comments. And we will take a close look at each of these items as we continue to refine and finalize the recommendation. So thanks for that. Next, we've got Fred Rappaport. Fred, let me ask you to unmute yourself.
Okay. Hi.
Hi, welcome.
Okay, great. Thanks. My question relates to the traffic costs in both the last presentation, presentation number 4, slide 17, and the current presentation, which I think is slide 17. So this relates to the Armory Way alternative. And as you may recall, there was a 13-minute extra traffic time calculated. And in the box on slide 17, it said $23.1 million, which I assume is an extra cost. And I'd like to know whether that cost is annual or one time or how it was calculated. And you don't have to answer that this very second. Then the second one relates to the current presentation, slide 17. I think that's the one that has all the various 4 scenarios on it. And in scenario 3 and 4, the new scenarios, I don't see any calculation of additional traffic time since we're having new density and higher density, et cetera. So if there is extra traffic time, what is that? And what is the extra traffic cost, since you've already quantified that in presentation 4 for what amounts to scenario 2, I believe, in Armory Way alternative. And thank you for allowing me to comment.
Great, thank you very much, Fred. I don't know, Kendra, if you have anything handy related to the scenarios or if that's something that we want to follow up on in terms of a response to the questions, but let me just pose that really quickly.
There we go. I was unmuting myself and I couldn't find my unmute button. That is something we did look at, the additional travel time. I don't have it with those scenarios, but that is something that I think we could come by in terms of the methodologies used to quantify that travel time into actually a cost to folks. That's actually something that Community Attributes led. But presumably we could share kind of our additional travel analysis that was done for the other two scenarios with Community Attributes and see if they could come up with a similar type calculation.
Okay, great. Great. We can follow up on those pieces. And then also, Fred, we can follow up on your other question related to costs.
Thank you.
Thank
I'll mute
you.
myself.
Thanks. Okay, next I would like to go to, I have somebody who's called in by phone, and I know I said I would read the last 4 digits, but you are showing up as call-in user number 1. If you'd like to unmute yourself by pressing *6. Give it a second. Hi there.
Hi there. I'm not the only one who dialed in. I was having problems actually dialing in via web to Zoom. So, and Jerry was so kind to reach out, but anyways, I kind of followed along with what everything that occurred. I have 2 principal lines of query.
Sorry,
I'm sorry. My name is Stephen Bajaszewski. And thank you, everyone, for all the effort and hard work in putting this together and reconnecting with us as part of the broader community and inviting us to your interagency meeting. One of the caveats presented early on was that you all anticipated full growth or full level growth in the recommendations that you were putting forward, which is great. Fred had acknowledged a couple of concerns, particularly on the Armory Way numbers that were presented. My question is, in these recommendations, knowing what little I know about historical efforts that you all acknowledged within the context of this dialogue, go back to shortly after the Nisqually quake, specifically for the Magnolia Bridge. There's extensive data on a couple of alternatives. And I guess my question is, why can't we, as part of this process, get to narrower than 2 alternatives? I know that there's a high-low kind of cost alternatives that you're providing, but it seems like we're not much farther along than we were, let's say, even 14 years ago in 2006, 2007, 2008. And it would seem really helpful to actually move this pendulum a little farther along to make a commitment and move forward to this. I mean, it just seems like we're not taking the opportunity that we should be as a broader community to get behind this. And the second part of that question is, why were the 2 alternatives outside of the high-low cost bifurcation tied together with and not actually dealing with each of the independent bridge projects in their high-low cost alternatives?
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Stephen. Tom, I know you talked for just a second as you were introducing some of the timeline and funding pieces of our conversation today about why we haven't come to a decision about one alternative versus another. Do you want to just say another couple words about that?
Yeah, and I mean, I can't speak to this fully, but certainly part of the challenge over the course of this year has just been competing priorities and, significant attention from the Seattle Executive's Office and the City Council on the multiple crises that is 2020. And so, we have a legislative deadline, we're moving towards that, but, the decision has not been confirmed at this point. So that's kind of where we're at with that. I don't know if Diane wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit. So, Stephen, we've heard your frustration and your comments voiced numerous times, especially from the Magnolia community. And I think the intention of BIRT all along, or the reason that your representatives at the state legislature created this project was indeed to help move things along and to help identify funding and to help kind of mobilize attention on the Magnolia Bridge. So I do think that this is a step towards the goal in moving that pendulum a little, right? So we will see if we're invited by the legislature, by Chair Fye of the Transportation Committee to come and present on this. And if so, we will certainly show up. And, you know, I think that at presentations like that, public can also comment. So I feel like we're moving, this study, we hope, moves the pendulum a little.
Thank you, Diane. And Stephen, we have your other question about the scenarios and the pairing noted. We did talk a little bit about that earlier on and can come back to it. I do want to make sure that we can hear the other comments, and then if we've still got a few minutes, we can circle back on this meeting. Otherwise, we'll follow up with you directly on that and can provide a written response if that works.
No worries. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Okay, next, let's go to Janice Traven. Janice, let me ask you to unmute. There you go. Uh-oh, Janice, that I can't quite hear you yet. There we go.
So I have a comment as a taxpayer in the city of Seattle and the state of Washington. I'm really disappointed that this study hasn't paid attention to a 2015, not 2002, not Nisqually earthquake, a 2015 environmental assessment of the Magnolia Bridge that references the type, size, and location for the Magnolia Bridge preferred alternative. I really don't like the idea of my tax money going to, I won't even say reinvent the wheel, but to pretend that it didn't occur and to visualize spending the same money on the same thing. With that said, I also question whether in the presentation, mentioning that the in-kind replacement can't be phased, I wonder whether the use of phase has taken on a new meaning since 2015, because the type, size, location study that was done and signed off on by SDOT, by WashDOT, and the Federal Highway Administration in 2015, the reason that the bridge is in that location is so that it could be phased. That's referenced numerous times in sections 1.5, 1.6, 1.7 of that environmental assessment that our tax money paid for. So I'm really very concerned about that. I also don't have a good way to explain to my Magnolia Community Council and fellow Magnolians a couple of things. One of them in particular is why the combination of the low-level Ballard Bridge and the in-kind replacement isn't in this report. Okay. I mean, why is that overlooked? It makes no sense. I mean, even if you really don't want to do it, you really don't want to do an expensive alternative, why isn't it considered? So,
do you want to continue? You think you said you had a couple of questions that you'd like. So Janice, if you want to go ahead and list them, then we can follow up on these pieces. Go right ahead.
Well, those are my questions.
Okay. All right. Great. I thought you indicated there was another one. So
well, the other thing that probably Pat is going to mention is that the study area for the environmental assessment, the previous work, went as far west as 34th, so it included the village. We had questioned last time about the additional travel time for Magnolia being 23 minutes, which didn't correspond to previous reports. That's because you're not comparing apples to oranges. And for those of us who live in Magnolia, we know that any movement of a Magnolia Bridge farther north is going to add a lot more than 13 minutes to travel time. Maybe not on 15th all the time, but just getting to 15th, getting home, which will add a lot of carbon, as much carbon as freight, just people sitting in traffic on Magnolia.
Okay, thank you. So I know Kendra wanted to respond related to the previous studies, and then I think in terms of the question around scenarios, as we noted with Stephen's question, I think we can prepare a written response for you and for the Magnolia community on that explains the decisions around the scenarios and how things were matched and what was included. But Kendra, do you want to chime in related to past studies?
Yes, I was thrown a little bit off guard with the earlier question, which I thought was more tied to if we looked at some early studies from 2000. I will say the 2015 type size of location, environmental assessment, those are all studies that we've looked at. And additionally, to make sure that we're really kind of taking into consideration a lot of historic knowledge, the city has actually asked us to do a lot of collaboration with the traffic consultant from that work. So that's Heffron Associates. They have been advising us along the way. So I just wanted to acknowledge that I think a bit of the confusion of us sounding like we're not aware of that was really just my misstep earlier in the meeting, and that I was thinking back, is there a question about a 2000 study? I was looking back through my files for that. But in terms of those more recent studies, which includes the 2015 and some of the more recent traffic analysis memos that date as recently as 2019, all of that has been considered in our analysis.
Great, thank you, Kendra. Okay, so an action item for the team then will be to follow up on the scenario questions that Janice and Stephen have raised. We've got a couple more folks who have indicated that they'd like to provide comments. So next I'm going to go to Laura Lowe. Laura, let me ask you to unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to read my notes here. I'm Laura. I'm a resident near 14th and Emerson. I think that industrial lands preservation and finding ways to legalize industrial uses in our residential zones is important to expand our industrial lands. I think this BIRT study is premature and will be outdated by the time we do our city industrial comp plan updates and complete our 2023-24 comp plan updates. I do understand logistically why this is happening now at the request of the legislature. I know that the great folks that worked on this BIRT study can't control the timing of all of it. I would like, for the sake of educating all the people that I organize with and do land use education for, that you acknowledge in your report that this is a big limitation in terms of long range planning for the city, that this is coming before we've done our comp plan update and our industrial lands updates, and that it makes the validity of this report a little bit out of date before it's even been released. I know we need to work to secure funding, and that's why we're doing this now, and that there will be future opportunities for people to weigh in. But I really want this to be super transparent, that the comp plan updates will have a big impact on our regional planning and our transportation planning, and that's happening in the next few years. A little bit about me: I spend every other day at the Magnolia Pea Patch. At least 2 days a week, I hang out at Smith Cove and have picnics. I do outreach to houseless folks in Ballard. I do my weekly grocery shopping there. I get lunch at the Fisherman's Terminal. I've really enjoyed living close to maritime industrial lands and learning about the memorial that acknowledges the lives lost in the fishing industry. I'm a brand new bike rider. I love my neighborhood has decent bike paths for a brand new bike rider. And as I've mentioned in previous meetings, I have a lot of trouble accessing the D line from Northwest Queen Anne to the overpass and the stairs, and some medical issues that means that it makes it really difficult for me to navigate the pathway to the bus. The point of talking about myself is that I drive and walk and bike on the roads discussed in the BIRT study, and I often think about the BIRT study as I'm going about my day. I appreciate the focus on multimodal approaches. I acknowledge that this recommendation doesn't know what the City of Seattle industrial lands planning recommendations are going to be around rezones. We're going to be putting in a bunch of more workforce jobs, and we need a plan for workforce housing in this area. There is going to be a lot of more traffic and a lot more neighbors, and we do need to kind of know like what the capacity is going to be in terms of planning our bridges. I hope that the recommendation for Magnolia Bridge funding and starting that work on planning it should come after the 2023 comp plan, so we know if Magnolia will be rezoned for more workforce housing. I do think that our conversations around freight travel are ignoring rail and ways to integrate with rail that might be more green and more climate friendly. I think that concurrency and synchronous planning is almost impossible here. But as someone who's new to following these processes, I find it really frustrating and kind of angering sometimes about the underlying assumptions of the report being kind of 20th century ways of thinking about land use instead of 21st century, and looking at the urgency of climate change and the housing crisis. So yeah, those are my feedbacks. In terms of questions, I just want to know, are you talking to BNSF? Are they at the table? And is there any understanding or note in the report about how the comp plan isn't going to happen until 2023?
Laura, thank you very much. Diane let me know that she'd like to respond in terms of connection with comp plan updates and other land use planning pieces. So Diane, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, Laura, thank you so much for your comments. The first thing I wanted to say is that when we first started the BIRT work, it did seem like it seemed incredibly fortuitous that we would be in sync with the mayor's maritime and industrial strategy. Then COVID happened, and that project was put on pause. That project is starting up again, like pretty much now, and will move through the winter of 2021. So we are having to qualify our language around some of our assumptions regarding land use. I agree that it would have been a beautiful thing if the comp plan had been updated. That was also pushed out. And so I feel like we are doing the best we can given the timing, the circumstances, and this like unprecedented moment in time.
Thank you very much, Diane. And last but not least on our list for today, we have Pat Kraft. Pat, let me ask you to unmute.
Mute. Hello.
There you go.
Thank you very much. I am Pat Kraft. For those who don't know me, I am the president of the Magnolia Chamber of Commerce. I also happen to sit as a trustee on the board for the Magnolia Community Council. I live in Magnolia some 18 years. I happen to have a great many things to say, but it's tough to get down to 2 minutes. So the first thing I would say is thank you all for this tremendous effort to create this BIRT study. This was a long time coming, that there be some coordination of great minds and all your engineering skills to look at that giant corridor and respect it for all its interactions that it provides. We as Magnolia, that is an artery to our lifeblood, all that interaction there. And that's never been fully recognized or respected. I would ask you, first, thank you for what you did, as I have said, but if you're involved in anything going further, because I know you're about to pass the baton off to someone else, if you come back around, come on up to Magnolia. I found in our discovery that we don't visit enough in person in the field. And I would encourage you engineers and great minds to get off your desk, come on up, walk around, drive around, let's visit. We have had a chance to do that with Diane. Jennifer, I really appreciate your efforts, but it's the living part of Magnolia that has to be considered. That's the people, the jobs, the industry. It's all very dynamic and it's critical to your work and what you're doing. If you look at your map, it is very frustrating to see the map and the coloration stop as it reaches up into the hillside, because the life is up in that hillside. What you guys have done, and again, trying to get this in the 2 minutes, is tremendous. But again, looking forward, we have to look to the future, as someone recently mentioned, and it's what we live with too. We're trying to develop Magnolia, Interbay, the Northeast Industrial Corridor, the housing within Magnolia. All these things are going to grow over time, and we want to embrace the change and the interaction. I think it's also incumbent not only to pitch your great BIRT study, which you will do in some handshaking moment, I won't witness, but you also have to help those people who don't understand what you've seen in the field. And that would be particular. There is no other option but a one-to-one replacement Magnolia Bridge. All years of these studies and great minds have shown that. We've got to let that go. You've got to take a group down to Armory, stand there at that chain link fence by the liquor store back there at Michael's Hobby Shop, and say, you know what, we're never going to fit a bridge to feed these people down this narrow roadway up and over Armory. It's never going to happen. So we need people to let that go and embrace what is going to happen, which is one-to-one placement, a great intermodal interaction for all these great visions. And that is the future. And to that future, I think it's great that the city is now embracing 124 bridges, a citywide vision for collective fundraising, and not pinning this on a vanity project for Magnolia. And then additionally, look to the federal government, look to the state and say, you know, we want to bring an example, regenerative roadways, solar powered cars, only electric fleets in these 2 neighborhoods. All these can be brought together as a great example. And we would love to be part of that future example of how you bring all this together in a valley, feed Queen Anne, Magnolia, and Ballard, and all of this main corridor together. So thank you again for all these efforts, and keep Magnolia in mind, and come visit us all and every time you get a chance. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Pat. And we do certainly look forward to being able to spend more time together in person as we all move forward. So thanks for that. Thank you all so much for your comments today. We just are always incredibly impressed by the engagement of the communities that are represented in the BIRT study, by all of the different stakeholders, and really appreciate the time and energy that people have put into this process and following along with us. So we are just a few minutes past our time, and I know we're going to continue to lose some folks to other meetings. So let me just wrap us up in terms of our next steps. And again, want to thank everybody for the time that you have made to join us today. So as we move forward, Jerry shared some of this timeline before. So for our interagency team members, October 9th will be the day that you get your draft plan to review. We will hold a 6th interagency team meeting just for informal discussion of the draft. And then on October 22nd, we'll be having our final public meeting for the study, and we'll look for comments from the interagency team as well. So just 1 month to go with all of this work. Again, want to thank everybody for their time, their energy and enthusiasm. And Diane, anything that you want to say as we wrap up today?
I want to thank everyone who has sat through this meeting today, our IAT, our community and stakeholders. And I also really want to thank our consultant team, and as well as the SDOT staff, Chisaki and Andres, for stepping it up. And we are just going to be running like little bunnies here on the rest of this project. So we will see you in a few weeks. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Diane. Again, thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we will see you soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.